Hello and welcome to Historia Romana. Appendix 1. General Timeline of Roman History. This first appendix is intended for listeners who know little to nothing about ancient Rome and would like some broader context for how this story will play out. If you feel you are familiar with the broad history of Rome already, or insist on going in blind, feel free to skip this video and go right to the Act 1 introduction. Half of why history is so important and why it is so inherently interesting to people like me is because every important person or event came from somewhere and will eventually be building towards something else. Given that this is a history project where I plan to go through the entire story of ancient Rome, I believe it is crucial to ensure that all listeners can easily follow along in the main narrative without becoming lost in the weeds, lest they be unable to comprehend the reasons behind why I get sidetracked into discussing aspects which have little to do with the current topic. To facilitate this video will serve as a concise timeline of all the events that I plan to cover in this project. By the end of this episode, I am hoping you can at least remember some of the more important milestones in Roman history, such as the birth of the Roman Republic, its subsequent collapse into empire, or the decline of the Western Roman Empire. Since this is just a summary, there is a lot of nuance that I will be leaving out, but the main concern for now is to just take in as much of this as you can, as it will all be elaborated on in its proper place. Legendary history. As with much of ancient history, most of what we know about the earliest generations of the Romans was written down many centuries later and shows very clear signs of embellishment and outright fabrication. While I will thoroughly examine these myths and misconceptions in their respective episodes, it is advisable to approach the following section with a healthy dose of skepticism. The story traditionally begins on April 21st, 753 BC, with the founding of the city we now recognize as Rome. Italy at this time consisted of a vast number of Italic tribes, each speaking a different dialect, practicing different rituals for different gods, and lacking any form of centralized government beyond the level of petty warlords. Rome itself was positioned along the Tiber River, situated at the northern boundary of the Latins, a prominent tribe occupying west-central Italy. According to legend, Rome's foundation is attributed to twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, who were the illegitimate grandchildren of a deposed Latin king. As infants, they were abandoned on the banks of the Tiber, but were miraculously saved and nurtured by a local shepherd. Upon reaching adulthood, they embarked on establishing their own settlement at the very location where they were once left to perish. However, disagreements arose between the brothers regarding the city's central location and the question of rulership, resulting in Romulus slaying his brother and naming the city after himself. Romulus ruled over Rome as its first king for 37 years, quickly establishing it as a regional military power. It was he who is said to have created many of Rome's most famous institutions: the aristocratic Senate, the first democratic assembly, and the first military legion. Upon his death, he was thereafter worshipped as a divine deity. As he had no sons to succeed him, the Senate and people of Rome decided they would elect a new king themselves, choosing the respected elder Numa Pompilius. Rome would ultimately elect 6 more kings after the death of Romulus, with each one adding a new institution or cultural practice that would live on for centuries. Numa, for example, established most of the city's temples and religious cults. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, abused his power and ruled with tyrannical authority. Eventually, the Roman people could no longer endure his cruelty, and the populace was led by Lucius Junius Brutus in an uprising against the monarchy in 509 BC. Tarquin and his family were exiled from the city, and a solemn vow was made to never allow another king to rule over Rome. To replace the monarchy, the Romans established a republic, or res publica, meaning public thing, which distributed power among the Senate, the popular assemblies, and 2 elected executives known as consuls. This new republic was not the democratic kind we think of today. Instead, it was originally an aristocracy controlled by men of noble blood, known as patricians, or fathers, who could trace their lineage back to the time of Romulus. This placed the patricians at odds with the plebeians, the commoners, who constituted the vast majority of the population, including everyone from poor farmers and laborers to rich merchants and artisans. The patricians' stranglehold on power prompted the plebeians to persistently advocate for political rights throughout the next 150 years, oftentimes violently. This tension peaked with the secessions of the plebs in 494 and 449 BC, in which a large chunk of Rome's population would leave the city until their demands were met. This period of struggle, later known as the Conflict of the Orders, ultimately granted the plebeians the right to hold most high offices by 367 BC. The most important of these were the tribunes of the plebs, an office entirely dedicated to protecting the rights of the common man and curbing the power of the aristocratic Senate. However, the patricians still remained the symbolic leadership class of Rome, and a man of any class would struggle to win elections if he had not seen service in the military, thus turning Rome from a blood aristocracy to a de facto stratocracy, ruled by veterans and popular military leaders. Throughout the 5th century BC, Rome came under attack from the surrounding Italic tribes, often having to resort to the temporary office of dictator to keep the city safe. Perhaps the most famous story of this period is the revered career and virtuous lifestyle of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, who twice held the office of dictator to save the Republic from its enemies, before retiring back to his small farm, a story later writers used to highlight the supposed corruption and degeneracy of their own ages. This cycle of ongoing border wars persisted until around 390 BC, when Rome suffered a devastating sack and near destruction by a marauding army of Gauls, a Celtic group native to modern France and the Alps. Thankfully, under the leadership of Marcus Furius Camillus, the so-called second founder of Rome, the city recovered over the next few decades, and the Romans pledged never to allow themselves to be dominated by a foreign foe again, particularly by uncivilized barbarians. Age of Expansion. Beginning around 350 BC, the Romans began their journey towards total domination of the known world, though they continued to frame these conflicts as defensive wars. The first phase of this expansion was carried out through a trio of wars with the Samnites, a major Italic tribe which rivaled the Romans for control of Italy. By the end of this conflict, nearly every tribe on the peninsula attempted to take a stab at defeating Rome, only for all to be subjugated. Once this was completed, the Romans then moved to take over the Greek colonies in southern Italy, which brought them into conflict with the mainland Greek kingdom of Epirus, a conflict which Rome also won by 272 BC. It was this conflict that finally got the Greeks to start taking note of Rome as a major power. And it's no coincidence that the first dedicated histories of Rome date to this era. These were not easy wars, however, and Rome was forced to adapt and create new strategies to fight in hostile foreign terrain, a trait that the legions would continue to utilize in the centuries to come. With their control firmly established over Italy, the Romans cast their gaze towards overseas territories for further expansion. One prominent target was the Mediterranean island of Sicily, which was occupied by Carthage, a powerful trading empire centered in North Africa. In 264 BC, the Romans, under the mistaken belief that the Carthaginians would not respond, dispatched an army to occupy the island. This miscalculation ignited the First Punic War. Throughout the conflict, the Romans maintained dominance on land, while the Carthaginians held control of the seas. The war unfolded over more than 2 decades, finally ending in 241 when the Carthaginians capitulated, agreeing to cede their Mediterranean islands to Rome. In the interbellum period, Rome pursued expansion in the Alps and along the coastline of the Adriatic Sea, while the Carthaginians continued their own conquest of Spain. It was there that the Barca clan, led by the renowned general Hannibal, gathered an army with the aim of seeking vengeance upon the Romans. In 218 BC, Hannibal instigated the Second Punic War, a conflict that would see him achieve a remarkable feat, leading his army over the treacherous Alps and initiating a guerrilla war against Rome in its own backyard. Hannibal's tactical brilliance resulted in several impressive victories, most notably the Battle of Cannae in 216, where he defeated a Roman army several times larger than his, and is often regarded as one of the most devastating defeats in all of military history. Despite suffering significant losses, the Romans demonstrated continued resilience and determination, eventually managing to reverse the tide of the war by making gains in Spain and launching a military expedition to North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home to defend Carthage. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, just outside Carthage itself, Hannibal was finally defeated by his Roman counterpart, Scipio Africanus. As a result, Carthage was compelled to surrender almost all of its territory to Rome and her allies. This marked a significant turning point in Roman history, with Rome emerging as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Now left with no rival power that could credibly threaten its existence, Rome almost immediately set out on a mission to conquer the rest of the Mediterranean. After 200 BC, the Romans sent their forces to Greece in order to check the power of Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, while supposedly liberating the other Greek cities. Initially, the Greeks welcomed Roman involvement, but they soon realized that the Roman armies had no intention of withdrawing. Consequently, several wars and rebellions erupted in the following decades as the Greeks resisted Roman occupation. Concurrently, the Romans found themselves entangled in a protracted quagmire in Spain, where numerous Celtiberian tribes rose in revolt against Roman exploitation. In all of Rome's overseas territories, most of the native population were not given the same rights as Roman citizens. They were generally treated as nothing more than cash cows to be used to line the pockets of Rome's leaders and fund further Roman conquests, and a good number were even taken as slaves to work in Roman households and plantations. Hence the numerous revolts that kept the Roman army coming back. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Romans had reached a tipping point and decided to take decisive action to secure their control over the Mediterranean. They mobilized 3 armies with the aim of establishing lasting dominance. The first attacked Carthage, who had finally begun to recover from the previous wars, and formally annexed North Africa into the growing Republican Empire in 146 BC. The second army sailed for Greece, defeated and sacked the city of Corinth, and finally put an end to the illusion of Greek independence, again in 146. The final army headed for Spain, but due to incompetence and stiff Iberian resistance, the region was not pacified until 133. Victory leads to decadence. Despite defeating all of its foreign enemies and successfully putting down all provincial revolts, the triumph of the Roman Republic contained the seeds of its eventual downfall. As the conquests ramped up through the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, a new class of Roman elite, the nobiles, the rich and famous families of both patrician and plebeian stock, had emerged to secure control over the Republic, transitioning Rome back towards oligarchy. With so much plundered wealth at their disposal, the nobles began to gobble up small Italian farms and create massive plantation estates. This was possible in large part because Rome's military was still a citizen army, with most campaigns expected to not last more than a single year. When the various wars of conquest and subsequent revolts dragged on for several years, many veterans returned to Italy to find their farms ruined in their absence, all but forcing them to sell their plots to the nobiles, who could afford to work their land with imported slaves. These displaced farmers migrated to Rome, adding to the growing numbers of unemployed citizens who relied on public assistance to survive. However, the Senate and other government officials failed to adequately address the needs of the urban poor, as they themselves were too busy competing with each other financially. In 133 and 123 BC respectively, 2 brothers known as Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were elected as tribunes of the plebs. They used their position to not only force through land and electoral reforms, but also impeach and remove officials who ignored the people's will, as well as claim jurisdiction over newly acquired provinces. Their actions provoked fear among the nobiles, who saw them as aspiring kings in disguise. Both brothers would be killed while in office, and many of their political allies were purged from public life. The movement to stand against the status quo did not die with the Gracchi, however, and soon 2 factions began to compete for power: the radical populares, or populists, who desired to continue the reforms the Gracchi had started, and the conservative optimates, translating as the best ones, who wished to uphold the traditional prerogatives of the nobiles and the Senate. The struggle between these two groups unfolded through elections, fierce debates in the Senate and popular assemblies, and even street clashes. The most prominent figure to come out of this mess was a novus homo, a new man who was not of nobilis birth, named Gaius Marius, who had earned his popularity with both the poor and the army by achieving great military victories in North Africa and northern Italy against barbarians. In the process, he implemented the Marian reforms, which revolutionized the Roman legions by turning them from a citizen army into a fully professional military. By doing so, he created an entirely new institution with its own goals and values, and whose loyalties would quickly transfer from the Republic to their own commanding officers. Marius also defied the established norms by being elected consul multiple times consecutively, utilizing his time in office to elevate his popularis allies to positions of great influence. It was only natural, then, that this political dominance would lead to violence. In 88 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an Optimus lieutenant of Marius whose position was now being threatened by his old patron, led his troops in a march on Rome to remove the Marian populares from power. When Sulla then left to go fight off an invasion in the east, the populares came out of hiding and initiated a bloody counterpurge of Sulla's Optimus allies. When Sulla returned and marched on Rome once again, the two sides engaged in a full-on civil war, with Sulla emerging victorious in 82 BC. Sulla proclaimed himself dictator for life, initiated a third bloody purge, rewrote the Roman constitution to prevent this exact situation from happening again, and then resigned from public life, restoring the Republic to its normal functions. Fall of the Republic. We now turn to the era that nearly everyone who knows anything about Rome loves to talk about. As much as Sulla and the Senate wanted to pretend that the period of strife was over, the civil war had clearly shown that all was not well with the Republican government. To ensure future stability, the Senate turned to two of Sulla's lieutenants, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was quickly establishing himself as the richest man in Rome, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, an arrogant opportunist who would soon accrue an impressive military streak. Despite their personal animosity towards each other, the two quickly realized that if they worked together, there was little that anyone else could do to stop their political advancement. Pompey worked to end a Marian revolt in Spain, clear the Mediterranean of pirates, and subjugated most of Anatolia, Syria, and Judea. Crassus, meanwhile, destroyed a slave uprising in Italy, led by Spartacus, and continued to cultivate political allies, including a young popularis nobilis named Julius Caesar. In 59 BC, with the backing of Crassus and Pompey, Caesar had obtained enough political capital to run for consul. While in office, he used coercive and unlawful tactics to force the Senate to pass further land and provincial reforms. Upon leaving office, Caesar was awarded the governorship of 3 northern provinces for 10 years, an unheard-of reward for his service. Provincial governors in the Republican era were already notorious for their corruption and exploitation of native peoples, but Caesar took it to a whole new level. Picking fights with various Gallic tribes, Caesar marched north and occupied all of Gaul by 52 BC, slaughtering and enslaving millions of people and establishing a huge power base for himself, all without permission from the Senate. Likewise, the 50s BC saw a return of street violence and political extremism, as radical populares and reactionary optimates both increasingly saw offices and institutions controlled by the other side as illegitimate. After Crassus got himself killed while trying to invade the Parthian Empire, modern Iraq and Iran, in 53 BC, the Senate once again turned to Pompey to restore order. Pompey, previously an ally of Caesar, now turned against him and began preparing to issue charges against Caesar for his illegal behavior during his time as consul and then governor. Caesar, not willing to let himself be prosecuted for his crimes by the Senate, decided to take matters into his own hands. In January 49 BC, he led an army south across the Rubicon River and marched on Rome, beginning another civil war. Pompey and the senatorial forces initially looked like they held the upper hand. but Caesar proved himself to be an even better commander than Pompey, utterly defeating their forces at the Battle of Pharsalus in August 48 BC, despite being outnumbered. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was promptly assassinated on the orders of the pharaoh. After declaring himself dictator, Caesar spent the next few years traveling across the empire, putting down Senate loyalist revolts and implementing various reforms to fix government corruption. However, while Caesar proved to be quite forgiving to his political enemies, many feared that Caesar would not relinquish his title of dictator for life, and that he planned to eventually make himself king. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar was surrounded and killed in Rome by a group of Senate conspirators known as the Liberatores, led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus Brutus, a descendant of the Brutus who founded the Republic. However, the Liberatores failed to plan ahead for what to do next, nor did they anticipate how popular Caesar had become with the common people. Soon enough, de facto power fell into the hands of two men: Caesar's former right-hand man, Mark Antony, and Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian. Temporarily agreeing to ally together to avenge their benefactor, Antony and Octavian chased the Liberatores to Greece, where they ultimately defeated them at the Battle of Philippi in October 42 BC. With the liberators dealt with and the Senate still weak, the two Caesarians agreed to split the Roman world between them. Octavian spent most of his reign in the West, trying to fix the effects of the civil war and deal with Sextus Pompey, son of Pompey the Great, who continued to nominally fight for the Senate's cause from his base on Sicily. Antony, meanwhile, engaged in a romantic relationship with the Egyptian pharaoh Cleopatra and tried to invade Parthia, with less than satisfactory results. When Octavian finally got rid of Sextus in 35 BC, the alliance between Octavian and Antony began to break down. The two sides met at Actium off the western coast of Greece in late 31 BC, where Octavian's fleet bested the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Retreating back to Egypt, the two committed suicide rather than be captured by Octavian, who subsequently annexed Egypt into the Roman Empire. An imperial settlement. With no enemies remaining within or outside of Roman territory, Octavian chose to finally bring an end to the Roman Republic, though he was careful to not kill it too openly. Instead of becoming a king or even a dictator for life, he styled himself as the princeps, or first citizen, essentially a protector of the fatherland. Instead of dismantling the Republic outright, he would simply hold all of the influential offices simultaneously, while appearing to work with the Senate in a co-equal relationship. Having been racked by a century of political crises, the Roman people and the Senate were willing to believe in this political charade if it meant the chaos would end. In early 27 BC, the Senate officially recognized Octavian's position, awarding him with the name Augustus, or the Illustrious One. They also awarded him the title of Imperator, Conqueror, from which we today derive the word emperor. Further adding to his legitimacy, the Senate recognized the deification of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, making him the first Roman since Romulus to be recognized as a god, though he would certainly not be the last, as many future emperors would get the same treatment. Augustus would protect Rome for 41 years as emperor, implementing a whole host of reforms and infrastructure projects to fix the cities and institutions left broken by civil war and neglect. Aside from a few campaigns south of the Danube and in Germany, not all of which were successful, he made few moves to outright conquer new territory, as he believed that Rome had now reached its natural borders and could not afford to keep expanding. Between his reforms and the general lack of military action, Augustus's reign marks the beginning of the Pax Romana, or the Roman Peace, a 200-year-long stretch that marked Rome at its economic, cultural, and military might. Despite not officially being a monarchy, Augustus made it clear that he expected one of his relatives to succeed him to the position of princeps. After several of his earlier picks died in mysterious accidents, he was eventually forced to settle on his stepson Tiberius, the patriarch of the Claudian family. Tiberius and the Julio-Claudian emperors who followed him did not live up to the high expectations set by Augustus. While the Roman Empire on the whole would continue to be stable and peaceful, The capital would be hit with several political scandals during their reigns, as factions of royal relatives and ambitious bureaucrats tried to control each emperor from behind the scenes, most of whom were not at all prepared for the powerful office they have been bequeathed. Tiberius became disinterested in governing as he grew older. His grandnephew Caligula was likely insane. His uncle Claudius at least attempted to do the job right, but had few men he could trust to get things done. The final member of the family, Nero, became so unpopular that he was declared a public enemy by the Senate in 68 AD. And he chose to commit suicide rather than face justice, taking with him the family line of Caesar. With no obvious relatives left to place on the throne, the Senate may now have had an opportunity to restore the Republic, making the reign of the Julio-Claudians just a temporary chapter in Roman history. Whether or not they even wanted to anymore, however, the decision was taken out of their hands by the group who now, more than ever, held the real power: the military. Unfortunately, with so many ambitious generals out in the provinces, this fight for the throne was only ever going to end in violence. Between June 68 and December 69 AD, 4 men would sit on the imperial throne, each one unseating the last, with only the eventual winner, Titus Flavius Vespasian, able to actually enjoy what he had won. The Golden Age. The elevation of Vespasian and his Flavian dynasty established the principle that an emperor did not need to be a descendant of Augustus to achieve legitimacy, so long as he could win on the battlefield and win over public opinion. Vespasian oversaw major infrastructure projects to repair the damage caused by Nero and the Year of 4 Emperors. The most notable of these was the Flavian Amphitheatre, known today as the Colosseum, where gladiator fights, chariot races, and other public games could be held. His son Titus, while only ruling for 2 years, was said to be the most generous of all emperors, especially given his response to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD. His brother Domitian was a more mixed bag. While generally competent and liked by the army, he displayed a complete disregard for the concerns of the Senate and became paranoid towards his court officials later in his reign. This ironically led them to assassinate him in 96 AD, while the Senate damned his memory, both figuratively in the history books and literally through decree. After the Flavians, we next turn to the so-called 5 Good Emperors, a series of distinguished men unrelated by blood. The first was an elderly bureaucrat named Nerva, whose only notable action in his 16-month reign was to appoint the popular general Trajan as his heir. Trajan, to put it simply, embodied Rome at its biggest. Casting aside Augustus's wishes to not further expand the empire, he forcibly incorporated new territory north of the Danube and in the Middle East, capturing huge stockpiles of gold while overseeing peace, stability, and economic growth at home. His cousin and successor Hadrian focused primarily on defense. Abandoning Trajan's eastern conquests soon after taking the throne in 117 AD, he spent most of his reign traveling across the empire to oversee various infrastructural and defensive projects, most notably the wall in Britain which bears his name. Hadrian, in turn, adopted a senator named Antoninus Pius as his heir, who oversaw arguably the most stable and calm 2 decades in Roman history, which ironically means we are told very little about it. It should be noted that while the empire as a whole was thriving during the Pax Romana, this did not necessarily extend to all its inhabitants. Almost all wealth continued to be held by the emperor and the Senate. Most rural farmers were forced to work as tenants on senatorial estates, while urban dwellers continued to live off of the same government subsistence programs as they had in the late Republic. Slavery continued to be commonplace, though slaves now lived under marginally better conditions, as the reduction in warfare led to fewer slaves being available to capture. To circumvent social tension, the emperors invested lavishly not only in food and housing projects, but also building massive artistic monuments and sponsoring epic histories which glorified the emperors. The Pax Romana saw what most modern scholars consider the peak of ancient Roman historians, with figures like Dionysius, Livy, Strabo, Suetonius, Plutarch, Tacitus, and Appian, not only leaving us valuable information on the ages that preceded them, but also playing a major role in defining how later historians wrote about and understood history itself. Upon Antoninus's death in 161 AD, he was succeeded by his two adopted sons, jointly ruling together, Lucius Verus, an incompetent but ultimately harmless emperor, and his elder brother Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher emperor. Though Marcus was a competent and thoughtful leader, his reign saw a continuing series of crises which would eventually lead to the end of the Pax Romana. The most notable of these was the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, which decimated the Roman population in general, and the legions in particular, even killing Lucius in 169 AD. With the army severely weakened, Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier began raiding into the empire, forcing Marcus to spend the second half of his reign leading multiple campaigns to push them back, to which he had largely succeeded by the time of his death in 180 AD. Age of Crisis. Unfortunately, Marcus made the poor decision to appoint his natural son Commodus as his heir. There is a reason why Marcus Aurelius is considered the last of the five good emperors. Commodus, to put it bluntly, is probably the worst Roman emperor of all, as he took an empire that was still relatively healthy and plunged it into the ground through indifference to political corruption by his court officials. Towards the end of his reign, he also fell into megalomania. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules and spent much of his time fighting in the Colosseum. By the time of Commodus's assassination in 192 AD, the Roman Empire had deteriorated into a vast quagmire of bureaucratic inefficiency and mutual loathing among the leadership. The economy was beginning to see rapid inflation, and the military had lost nearly all semblance of discipline. With no heir in place, Rome once more found itself in a civil war, specifically the Year of the Five Emperors, as a nice nod to inflation. From this bloody mess emerged the North African-born Septimius Severus, a no-nonsense general who probably regretted having to fight a civil war just to be left fixing the administrative mess Commodus had left. Needless to say, the main priority of Severus and his successors was on keeping the army happy at the expense of everyone else, slowly turning the Roman Empire from an supposedly enlightened monarchy into an open military dictatorship. His loathsome son, Caracalla, went so far as to grant citizenship to all free males in the empire. This may sound good, but this was primarily a measure to increase the imperial tax base, thus depriving the provinces of economic growth so that Caracalla could pay his soldiers lots of bonuses. The final Severan emperor, Alexander, was actually a fairly diligent ruler for such a young man, but soon proved to have little taste for warfare. When he tried to first bribe the Sassanid Persians, who had overthrown the Parthians in 224, into peace, and later tried the same trick again with the marauding Germans to the north, the army mutinied and overthrew him in 235, replacing him with the popular general Maximinus Thrax. Unfortunately, the overthrowing of the Severan dynasty did not bring stability or honor back to Rome, but instead initiated its most chaotic and destructive period, the crisis of the 3rd century. In this 50-year period, nearly 40 men would attempt to claim the title of emperor. As the Roman armies were turned against each other, invaders from both Germany and Persia would raid and sack the frontiers, while many provinces tried to break away from Roman control altogether. The remaining Roman population was further decimated by the plague of Cyprian, which likely even killed several emperors. The economy, already weakened under the Severans, now completely collapsed, with many regions resorting to a barter economy to survive. The period peaked with the capture of the Emperor Valerian by the Persians in 260, but then saw first a stabilization under Valerian's son Gallienus, and then a recovery initiated by Aurelian in 270. The crisis finally ended around 285, with the elevation of Diocletian as sole emperor. Reconstruction and Conversion. Diocletian quickly recognized that, in its current state, the Roman Empire was simply too big for any single man to rule by himself. Emperors could no longer trust their field commanders to remain loyal, and so had to keep the majority of the army on hand wherever they went. And since emperors can only be at one place at a time, the rest of the empire would be left to suffer when outside forces inevitably came knocking. Additionally, he knew that the Roman bureaucracy and economy needed to be repaired if the empire was to have any hope of long-term survival. Plan in mind, Diocletian set out on a whole sweeping set of reforms. He restyled himself as a dominus, lord and master, rather than a princeps, to solidify his absolute power, and constantly affirmed that his authority came not from the Senate, people, or even the army, but the gods themselves, marking the first use of the concept of divine right to rule in Western politics. He moved the capital of the empire outside of Rome, closer to the frontier where he was needed, and away from the increasingly irrelevant Senate. He repaired and expanded the bureaucracy to better acquire taxes and new soldiers. He split up provincial duties so the head administrator and head general of a province were no longer the same man, which made it easier to carry out their specific tasks as well as harder to revolt. He installed universal price caps to get inflation under control, which didn't really work, and he locked many professions into hereditary careers, the origin of medieval serfdom. His most famous reform, however, was to split the job of emperor into four in 293 AD in a system known as the Tetrarchy, so that each corner of the empire would have an emperor on hand without having to worry about field commanders revolting. After all, why try to revolt against the emperor when you are the emperor? Focusing on merit and loyalty rather than blood ties, he elevated 3 trusted commanders to aid him. This system worked well while Diocletian was in power, but after he voluntarily abdicated the throne in 305, the first emperor to ever do so, the Tetrarchy quickly fell apart, as none of his successors had the skill or desire to maintain this delicate balance of power. After nearly 20 years of civil war, Constantine the Great emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Constantine, however, brought with him to the throne a strange new religion, Christianity. Created back in the 1st century AD by Jesus of Nazareth, who preached that he was the Son of God, Christianity taught that there was only one true God, and that by worshipping him and following his commandments, one could secure everlasting life in heaven. The early Christians were continually persecuted by Roman officials for their unwillingness to acknowledge the emperors as living gods. But they nonetheless spread across the empire, making up nearly 10% of the population by the early 300s. Constantine, having converted to Christianity during the wars of the Tetrarchy, continually pushed for toleration of the growing faith, and then formally legalized it in the Edict of Milan in 313. Once in total power, he held an empire-wide meeting of Christian leaders in 325, known as the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, in order to hammer out a universal Christian doctrine. He subsequently allowed more and more Christians into positions of power, who in turn made moves to spread and entrench the religion across the empire. Also in 325, Constantine identified an ideal spot along the Bosporus Strait, the waterway between Greece and Anatolia, to construct a brand new Christian capital for himself, New Rome, later known as Constantinople. When Constantine died in 337, the empire returned to a divided state. His eldest son, Constantine II, quickly got himself killed in a pointless civil war, while his youngest son, Constans, was eventually overthrown in 350 due to his unpopularity with the Western army and was replaced by the general Magnentius. This was one of the unintended side effects of the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. By splitting up the military commands into smaller areas, it simply created regional alliances of like-minded generals who could more easily force their will upon the emperor. Magnentius tried to make peace with Constantius II, the last surviving brother, but given that his only right to the throne was that he was a son of Constantine, Constantius could not accept someone from outside the family ruling as co-emperor. He headed west, and after several bloody battles, defeated the usurper in 353. However, recognizing that he couldn't rule the empire all by himself, Constantius elevated his cousin Julian as a junior emperor. Julian was still a pagan, hence the common epithet the apostate, but soon proved himself a skilled military commander in his campaigns against the Germans. However, Constantius and Julian soon grew suspicious of each other, and just as Julian was about to launch a full invasion of the East, Constantius II died in 361 and left the whole empire to him. Julian spent his short reign as sole emperor trying to turn back the tide of Christianity, with no lasting success, and launching an invasion of Persia, which went horribly and resulted in his death in 363. He was followed by Jovian, a junior officer who extracted the army from Persia, reversed Julian's edicts on Christianity, and promptly died in an accident 8 months into his reign. Once more, the army commanders elevated one of their own to the throne, the hot-headed Valentinian, who quickly elevated his brother Valens as co-emperor. Valentinian would rule in the west, which was beginning to face increasing strain from marauding Germanic tribes on the one hand and rebellious provinces on the other. He would infamously meet his end in 375 from an aneurysm due to anger and stress, leaving the west in the hands of the teenage Gratian and infant Valentinian II, or more accurately, their generals. Valens, meanwhile, had to face the problem of not having enough troops to keep out both the Persians in the east and the Germanic Goths in the north. This situation became even more tenuous with the arrival of the Huns, a Eurasian steppe tribe who slowly pushed the Germans further west and south. This eventually resulted in the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378, where Valens and most of his army were slain by the Goths. The end approaches. With the Goths rampaging through the Balkans and with no emperor in the east, the Western Emperor Gratian appointed to the job the general Theodosius. While unable to defeat the Goths in open battle, Theodosius eventually got them to agree to a treaty which allowed them to settle en masse in Roman territory. While Germans had previously been allowed to settle on Roman territory in small controlled groups in order to bolster the ranks of Rome's army, what Theodosius did, and what his successors will allow to continue, would create one of the main reasons why the Western Empire will soon fall. Theodosius was a devout Nicene Christian and did not take kindly to heretics or heathens. In the Edict of Thessalonica of 380, he officially made Nicene Christianity the state religion, something often mistakenly attributed to Constantine, and initiated persecutions of heretics, pagans, and Jews, setting another trend for those who would follow him. He was also distrustful of his Western counterparts and would wage 2 civil wars to enforce his will upon the Western court, which would leave the West even weaker than before. He would ultimately find himself as sole leader of the whole empire for the last 5 months of his reign, making him the last emperor to hold that distinction, as upon his death in January 395, the Roman Empire would never again be fully united. His 2 young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, were clearly not up to the job. They were easily dominated by their court officials and advisors, each of whom quickly turned on one another to gain total control over their puppet rulers. With both courts consumed by palace intrigue, there was nothing stopping the Germanic hordes from migrating across the frozen Rhine in 407, intending to permanently settle in Gaul. Soon enough, in 410, Rome itself was sacked by an army of Goths, the first time the Eternal City had been captured by a foreign army in 800 years. By the end of Honorius's reign in 423, most of Gaul and Britain had been permanently lost. Honorius was eventually replaced, after a short civil war between East and West, by his nephew Valentinian III. He was no more effective than Honorius, however, as his 30-year reign would see Spain and North Africa be lost to the Germans. His top general and advisor, Flavius Aetius, would prove to be the last great commander of the West, eventually repelling an invasion by the infamous Attila the Hun in 451. Unfortunately, Aetius was soon after executed by the paranoid emperor. Valentinian himself was soon assassinated by a vengeful commander in 455, ending the last Western dynasty and opening the door for Rome to be sacked once again, this time by the Germanic Vandal tribe. The final 20 years of the Western Empire is mostly filled by a list of nobodies. The one standout, Majorian, made an attempt to reconquer Gaul and Spain, but was ultimately betrayed by his political ally Ricimer and executed in 461. After him, the throne became a revolving door of powerless figureheads who controlled a smaller and smaller area of land, until only Italy itself remained. Finally, on September 4, 476, The Germanic warlord Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the western capital, and removed the young Romulus Augustulus from power, declaring that the West no longer needed an emperor. The Eastern Emperor, Zeno, was left with little choice but to recognize this fait accompli, and the empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for almost 700 years finally came to an end, at least in the West. The Eastern Empire, however, would survive for another 1,000 years. Commonly known today as the Byzantine Empire, this remaining half of the realm never stopped calling itself Roman, and many of the ancient institutions and cultural practices of ancient Rome would live on well into the Middle Ages in Constantinople. There were a few attempts made in future centuries to retake what had been lost in the West, most notably by the Emperor Justinian, who retook North Africa and Italy in the mid-6th century. But the Eastern Empire proved unable to hold these areas for long. Meanwhile, the various barbarian tribes that had overtaken the Western Empire began to settle down and formalize their new nations, often using discarded Roman institutions as the bedrock for their own governments. The most notable of these were the Franks, who had conquered most of Gaul and would go on to take Germany and northern Italy, creating what is today called the Holy Roman Empire, reflecting the emperor's nominal subservience to the Pope around 800 AD, as well as forming the cultural bedrock for both modern France and Germany. Naturally, the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire would spend many centuries bickering over who had the right to call themselves true Romans. But that story is beyond the scope of this project. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time.